So you've gotten your topic and you've developed a working thesis, and now you're ready to find more detailed primary sources, probably more specific primary sources to add to the ones that you've already read to get to your working thesis. So here we are back at the historical newspapers, and let's say we have a more focused topic. And I'm going to point out a couple of things that can be really useful for you in terms of drilling down and actually finding that. The first one is with keywords. Keep in mind that one of the key pieces about you reading carefully the initial sources while you were still trying to figure out your topic is to look at the language that they're using. I always give the example of World War I. Nobody called World War One when it happened because they didn't know there was going to be a World War II. So knowing what something is called at the time when they're calling it is important. Sometimes Susan B. Anthony is called Miss Anthony when writing articles about women's suffrage because that was the formal address at the time. So those are key things that you need to go ahead and keep in mind, and just keep your eyes out for it as you find things so that you come up with good search terms. But let's take a look here. We've talked about how you can search by decade or with specific dates. Note also that if you really do want to focus on just one area of the country, you can absolutely do that as well as use the city as a search term. I want to point out though that in addition to these things right here, we know that we default search the general article, the front page article, and editorials. Note also that if you're doing your paper on Mark Twain and a specific work and his impact on American writing, click on obituaries and get several of his obituaries from across the country and see what they're pointing out at the time of his death, what was important about him. Similarly, editorial cartoons can be really helpful, particularly with things that are more social history. There's a lot of really awful editorial cartoons about the women's movement or birth control. Display ads are also really helpful if you're doing something about the founding of the department store and how they catered specifically to women. Looking at an analysis of display ads over newspapers can be really useful. Similarly, reviews. If you're doing Edith Wharton and her works as your focus and what they say about a time period, well, click on review because you want to see what people are writing when that particular book is published, or a play, or whatever work of literature that you're doing. Taking a look at the more here, look at how much in depth you can get if you really want to do the weather, if that was an important thing related to the event, if you want to do letters to the editor or somebody's marriage. Fire loss, you're doing something on fire technology of the time period, which grew in leaps and bounds. This is all really interesting and really important, and you can actually get a lot more specific. But let's take a look back at our topics that are from the timeline. I really thought there was a lot in the progressive era that was really interesting. I was thinking about the women in progressivism, and one of the things that I thought was neat was how they went ahead and characterized settlement houses. And settlement houses were a specific movement, probably most popularized by Jane Addams, Addams with two D's, who went ahead and founded a series of settlement houses that were sort of community centers that were meant to go ahead and encourage immigrant populations to come and assimilate and learn how to be American while also alleviating the poverty that many of them found themselves in. And as with so many things in the progressive era, it is seriously a mixed bag in terms of both harm and showing sort of racism in that time period, as well as showing true altruism and being an example of progressivism. So here's a New York Times article from 1893 about elevating the poor by means of settlements, and it's talking all about Miss Addams, who they spell her name wrong, by the way. So clearly this reporter did not do a great job. But there's some interesting things that they say in there. So I can go through and take a look in my search results and find things related to Jane Addams, right? I can also go ahead and search on Jane Addams. And if I did, I would probably put her settlement. Do I have too many T's in there? Hang on. Settlement house. I can go ahead and do that. I'm going to put her in quotation marks so that it knows I'm looking for Jane Addams together. Looks like I've got 6 results with those 4 words before 1899. Chicago's Charity, that sounds about right. Women's missionary work, that sounds about right. So there are lots of things I can go into here, like Smith Housing Plan, early morning call at Hull House, but that's 1925, so I want to stick to something earlier. So there's plenty here that I can find. Quite frankly, there was enough in that topics list that I could find a good 4 or 5 articles. What if I want more? What if I want things that aren't newspapers or different perspectives? One of the links we have in the LibGuide is for this. It's another new resource that we have this year. It's American Periodicals. It's a college and graduate level database that incorporates major periodicals and pamphlets from the 19th and 20th century, actually some 18th century, but for our purposes, it has a real explosion of publications in the 19th century, and there are a lot of them here that are very characteristics and were well known. So I'm going to do my same thing. I'm going to do Jane Addams um, Settlement House just to see what they've got, and I have 377 results. Look how it's trying to change her name too. Poor Jane. She had to probably spell that her whole life. So here we go. I've got the life story of Jane Addams. And that looks like it is from 1911. So this could be an interesting retrospective that nevertheless was from the time period. And notice it's highlighting my search terms. I can go ahead and I've clicked on this to add it to my selected items, which is kind of my shopping cart, very similar to the historical newspaper shopping cart that I used for myself. This is from the Chautauquan, which is a really funny word, but was actually an incredibly important news magazine of the 19th and early 20th century, and it was based out of New York State, where a lot of intellectuals went to talk about key issues, many of which are very progressive. So here is a specific article about Jane Addams, and reading this over, because I glanced at this before I did this video, it's really fascinating because it's talking about how she was a speaker at a speaking engagement where there were a bunch of people who were talking about some recent violence in Russia. And this was before the Tsar was dethroned, and how one of the people who were speaking was so engaging that he riled up everybody and had people basically like chomping at the bit, wanting to kill the Tsar and having all these violence against his family. And Jane Addams stood up and went ahead and kind of gently reminded everyone about the importance of peace. And this was kind of fascinating to me because in looking at the historical newspapers, I came across her obituary from 1930 something, and it was talking all about how she won, the Nobel Peace Prize and was known as this huge proponent of pacifism, and was, deeply concerned after World War I. And that was something I didn't really think about her, because I think about her being a settlement person. But if I hadn't read those articles, I wouldn't have known that. So this can be a really great place to go ahead and take a look. And if I even decided, like, wow, that's really interesting, what if I went ahead and used peace as the key term? Well, now I have 536 results. And I have some interesting things. So I have no idea what Learn from the Devil Baby is. That's fascinating. Lady of the Melting Pot, that could be kind of interesting, talking more probably Women's Peace Congress. Okay, so that is more the theme of peace. So this is what I mean about the importance of really reading so carefully and seeing those terms that keep coming up and seeing if it's a thread that interests you, because now maybe I'm going to have a working thesis that has to do with the fact that Jane Addams transitioned from working in settlement houses and helping immigrant populations with a specific perspective into issues, more global issues of peace. And that could be kind of an interesting thing to sort of work at and see how I can hone that and prove something. That could be really interesting. So as you can see, we have a really nice option here. And once again, these are all PDFs, so it's very straightforward to go ahead and save these into our Google Drive and download them. So this is a wonderful resource that really should be added to, specifically if you want to do something more literary as well. The American Periodicals is a terrific place to go, since so many authors did short stories or had literary criticism of the time period. So this is a wonderful place to go ahead and find primary sources over a variety of topics. So as always, let us know if you have any questions or if you're struggling to find things, because that's the reason that we live at the desk. We love questions and we want to go ahead and help you be successful. Good luck.